Most of us are aware of the risk we would incur by not paying our taxes. We don't really think to consider the risk that we assume by continuing to pay them. I've spent the last few years assessing that risk, and as someone who is experienced in both risk and in navigating our legislative process, I feel not only qualified to offer this perspective, I feel obligated.
In our personal lives, it's the moments of deeply painful awareness that require us to cultivate resilience and a level of personal agency that we didn't know we were capable of. The moments that invite us to step into our power.
Perhaps this is one of those moments, but on a larger scale, for all of us to experience and make use of as a collective.
The story we're told is that our country was founded upon sovereignty and agency and specifically representative taxation. And we pride ourselves on those founding values.
The truth is that those freedoms require maintenance and action on behalf of the people.
Someone I consider to be one of the most brilliant social philosophers of our time, Daniel Schmachtenberger, founding member of the Consilience Project, had this message to share about existential risk at Stockholm Impact Week last year.
I feel an obligation to have more people understand more of the situation they find themselves in and hopefully care more deeply. If I'm going to express what I was reacting to today is that I do believe we're at the end of history. Like eminently in the lifetimes of everyone in this room, we're at the end of history. Meaning the thing that has been more successfully dominant, extracted more, grown its population more, increased its violence capability wins. That thing, with exponential tech at planetary boundaries, self-terminates. So either we're at the end of our species, or we're at the end of our species being defined by those parameters. The last thing I'll say when I was thinking about the Nazis and everyone else in those situations is the famous quote, lots of people have said a quote like this, that it's the complicity of the weak with the wicked that allows the evils of the world to happen. Most of the Nazis were not Hitler, but Hitler couldn't have done shit without a lot of people who obeyed. Most of the Mongols were not Genghis Khan. Most of us are not people that make the choice to make up bullshit reasons for wars that are false flag for truly economic and geopolitical reasons, but we will still not get in the way of that thing happening. The Iraq war that started all of the recent rounds of wars because of the weapons of mass destruction that we knew they didn't have. Where are the prosecutions for that? Because 4.5 million people were murdered. There are a small number of people who are motivated by power pretty exclusively. And then there's most everyone else who just needs to pay the bills and not rock the boat too much. I don't want people to think about how to make their own life regenerative. I want people to think about what it would take to turn the entire arc of humanity, factoring what is currently driving it, and that everything else that you could do doesn't matter at all, because the end of the possibility space of all meaningful human activities is imminent if we don't do that.
That's probably the most direct I've ever heard Daniel speak, and it's likely due to the nature of that conference. But his style is always very matter-of-fact, and that's why I find him to be so impactful. There's no agenda behind his words. Democracy can only work when the people are able to hold governments accountable. In order for this to be possible, the people need to be educated in the dynamics and issues of their government. There is no democracy now. We, the people, don't adequately understand the issues. We aren't involved in the dynamics of government, and we have no way of effectively advocating for ourselves.
If you want anything like a democratic or open society where everyone gets to participate in choice making, then everybody has to do a good job of sense making. Minimum required investment is authentic, deep informedness about the nature of the issues, which also requires adequate educatedness to be capable of that.
When the people can't control the state will be captured by the market. The solution begins with the recognition that even though we live in a democracy, we actually aren't sovereign. What is needed is a cultural enlightenment and a rebellion at the level of self. That is, a deepened sense of responsibility which involves more awareness. His point is that emergent order can only come from the bottom up, from the collective sense-making and agency of the people.
I think it's clear that the things called news are mostly propaganda, narrative warfare for some agency.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish things that simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 The things called news are mostly propaganda, narrative warfare for some agency, and that they aren't good sources of sense making. Where are the high signal, low noise sources that I can offload some of the cognitive complexity of making sense of the world to? The answer is really sad. This goes deep. And how do we make good choices if we don't have good sense making? Well, obviously we can't. But due to increasing technological capacity, right? Increasing population multiplied by increasing impact per person, with worse and worse sense making to inform those choices, which is running increasingly fast through the woods, increasingly blind. The cognitive complexity of issues that the world faces is more than a single person can process. It requires collective intelligence and collective sense making. If we actually want to empower people, I don't want them to defer their sense making to me, but I also don't want them to do lazy, shitty sense making, which means I want them to grow the quality of their own sense making, which means to grow the depth of their care, right? Anti-nihilism, to grow the depth of their earnestness, to pay attention to their biases and where their sloppiness in thinking, their own skills and capacity. I want them to grow their attention span and both the clarity of their logic and the clarity of their intuition and the noticing when something's coming from intuition or logic and how to relate those, like all of those things. But that's actually what increasing sovereignty means.
That content was chopped up from a series called The War on Sensemaking from the Rebel Wisdom channel, which I highly recommend checking out and will link to below in case you're interested. To be clear, I've never heard Daniel advocate for us to stop paying our taxes. He does often talk about how we lack the power to check the state. That power is what incentivizes the government to work in our best interest. Without it, we're putting our well-being at risk. The question I'm putting forth is, what if this is our only option? My intention is to share with you a perspective that you may not have heard in order to begin collectively endeavoring to make sense of what is going on and to decide, while we still can, if this is who we want to be and if this is the direction we really want to go.
Chapman University conducts annual research on Americans' top fears. In their 2020-2021 survey data, government corruption topped the list, with 80% of Americans saying they were afraid or very afraid of corrupt government officials. For the 6th year in a row, the top fear of Americans is corrupt government officials, and as in the previous 5 years, that fear far exceeds all others, including terrorist attacks, communism, mass shootings, nuclear weapon attacks, pandemics, murder, North Korea, heights, and death. We are more afraid of government corruption than we are of dying. Fear of government corruption topped the list again in 2023 and has every year that they've conducted the survey. If anything, it should be the other way around. At least, I guess that's how I feel. If you want to jump straight to the T, timestamps are below. That said, this information is relevant, and I'd love it if you'd hear me out. One of the saddest lessons of history is this: if we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. Once you give a charlatan power over you, you almost never get it back. I knew from my time in DC that things were pretty broken. I knew that the people had no advocate. But it wasn't until a few years ago that I started to comprehend the magnitude of what we might need to protect ourselves from. Wasteful spending is, in and of itself, something I believe we should take action to correct, especially in a time where so many Americans are struggling to make ends meet.
Here, I'll present evidence that the situation might be a lot more serious than that. Evidence that we are being harmed in very real ways and that we are assuming immense risk by continuing to offload our governance to a system we're unable to hold to account. Before we get into it, I'd like to clearly state that I'm not attributing malice to any of our elected officials. I'm sure some of them are shitty people, but the ones I've met with are as fed up with the system as I am. Many of them endeavored into politics for the right reasons, but if you want to make a difference, you have to stay in the game. And to stay in the game, you gotta play. The problems we face are a product of our incentive structure. Conspiracy and information warfare are emergent properties of a system that has been captured by the market. The market incents for profit and growth. It's not concerned with the best interest of the people. Meaning, when our best interest interferes with profit and growth, like in the case of tobacco and opioids, our well-being will be foregone in favor of what drives the market. This isn't necessarily nefarious, it's economics. Understanding the market means understanding competitive game theory dynamics, where players are motivated by whatever increases their advantage. My point is that conspiracy and information warfare are not only to be expected, they are inevitable in competitive market dynamics. Denying their existence is as intellectually lazy as projecting their certainty. We should always be conscious of their emergence and diligent in our response, until and unless we get the money out of politics and recapture our governance. This is partially what Daniel meant by shifting the entire... This is probably a good time to discuss the psychology behind the use of the term conspiracy theorist and why it can reveal a lot about an agenda and its strategy. By waging ad hom attacks against the people raising concerns, our neurochemistry is being weaponized to discourage us from seeking information that would jeopardize the advantage of an agenda. If someone is asking questions that we don't want them to have answers to, we can single them out as a minority and call them a derogatory name so that everyone else gets a dose of oxytocin for being part of the non-question asking enlightened majority. This is an incredibly effective tactic because we are deeply programmed biologically to fall for it. This evolutionary vulnerability no longer serves. It's been weaponized. Our basic needs for certainty and safety have been hijacked, and now our survival depends on us figuring that out. 100,000 years ago, if everybody was running from something, you ran too, because whatever was chasing them was going to eat you. But we've killed all those things, and now the only thing threatening our survival is ourselves. Our government has been captured by the market because we failed to uphold its accountability to the people. In addition to information, our neurochemistry, and our basic needs, I would argue that accountability itself has been weaponized. We don't just fail to demand accountability, we fail to hold space for it. I don't know whether this is another collective illusion or not, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But I definitely came across some disturbingly polarizing headlines while researching this topic. Pew Research Center conducted a survey in 2020 to find out what Americans think the term cancel culture means and how they feel about it. According to their data, half of the people familiar with the term said cancel culture describes actions people take to hold others accountable. I thought Pew's article did a pretty good job reporting on the full range of perspectives without bias, but the data itself was a little scary. The truth is that being human is hard, and mistakes are inevitable. Lying about them is easy, but it comes at a price. Lying costs us personal congruence. It separates our self-worth from who we actually are and instead attaches it to the lie. That's a price none of us should be willing to pay. It's also not something we should look up to or tolerate from our leaders or government. Taking radical accountability for our actions requires a high level of integrity and agency and psychological resilience. These are the people worthy of our trust in leadership roles. Low accountability is often correlated with low psychological resilience, which is correlated with things like difficulty seeing reality clearly, emotional immaturity, and psychopathology. These are not leadership traits, they are layers of risk. They fall under one of the most important categories of risk evaluation, which we'll come back to. But due to cancel culture, the risk threshold for radical accountability is incredibly high. Most people won't endeavor toward radical accountability if they risk being canceled for doing so. So if democracy can only work when the people are able to hold governments accountable, then we need to lower that risk threshold, and accountability is something that we need to learn to hold space for.
And let leaders emerge. Transparent, accountable leaders. Like, I'm okay with a leader that smoked a little bit of pot and made some mistakes. Like, I would love to have a candidate that could just be like, yeah, I did some dumb shit, and like, here's what I learned from it.
Managing risk means being intellectually responsible for and radically conscious of our beliefs. Our basic needs for certainty and safety have been hijacked because in game theoretic dynamics, players increase their advantage by capturing our beliefs. Let's talk about certainty really quick. This is not a real graph. I made it up to illustrate my point. We will call it the projected certainty curve. The y-axis here showing projected certainty regarding x meaning literally any polarizing thing dividing the population, with the anti-X people here and the pro-X people here. These are often the only two perspectives we hear about. They both tend to project extremely high levels of certainty, which we can call premature certainty, when the truth is usually somewhere in here. We could also draw this graph to look like this, replacing the certainty axis with how much media attention something gets, where we either hear about this extreme or this extreme, even though most people live here. In terms of social media attention, this misrepresentation is usually due to algorithms optimizing for attention and engagement, firing up all the bots and keyboard warriors. But in terms of mainstream media, it's usually an agenda. In which case, we could also draw the graph like this, where the y-axis represents the percentage of people for or against X. These are the crazy conspiracy theorists who don't support the agenda. And this is the enlightened majority that thinks the agenda is the best thing ever. In reality, the distribution is usually something more like this, where most of us hold some nuanced perspective in the middle with varying levels of uncertainty. But by making us think that most people believe X is great, they can either drive the middle people into silence or eventually capture the people with lower psychological resilience, because if everyone else believes it, they may as well believe it too. Either of these scenarios, whether the information is misrepresented due to algorithms or agendas, often result in a collective illusion. A collective illusion is effectively a social lie, where something is held to be true because we think most people believe it, even if most of us privately don't believe the thing. So even though most of us live here, this thing becomes true because we think people believe this.
This term comes from the book by Todd Rose, which offers really powerful insight on the psychology of conformity.
Reality is becoming a battleground covered in landmines of collective illusions and premature certainties. Our information ecology is broken, and meanwhile we just keep creating more catastrophically destructive shit.
This is what Daniel was referring to when he discussed the elusive high-signal, low-noise information sources. The extreme perspectives are noisy. Because the media chooses to fixate on those, we're missing out on all the high-signal, low-noise information. And that's a problem because that's where the truth lives, along with accountability, sustainability, congruence, and any hope of a shared reality for humanity. Up here is a broken information ecology that increasingly divides the population into separate realities as it moves further away from the truth and eventually self-terminates. You might be wondering what the hell any of this has to do with paying our taxes. The answer is a lot. Determining risk requires us to process information well. In this battle for our minds, it's not just about what we consume, it's about how we consume it. It requires deep awareness about the state of our information ecology and why it is so broken. Assessing risk is an infinitely valuable skill, one that could help shift the entire arc of humanity by arming the people with the power of discernment. A skill with the potential to disrupt the asymmetry of power, which is why no one's going to teach it to us and it's on us to develop. We've talked a lot about accountability, but we haven't defined it. Accountability is the obligation to bear the consequences for failing to perform as expected, or the liability is paramount in determining risk. To be responsible for and answerable for our actions and performance. What is risk? Broadly defined, it's the possibility of something bad happening. Evaluating risk can get complicated, but for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. We do it all the time. We can also think of risk in terms of FOMO, or the fear of missing out. In economics, we call this opportunity cost, or what we're giving up by choosing one thing over another. So, for example, when we're trying to decide whether we want to go out or stay in. When we choose to party, we're giving up rest and sleep. And if we choose to stay home, we're giving up the experience of going out, so the opportunity cost would be fun and connection. Framing it this way helps illustrate how we constantly manage risk, pretty much every time we make a decision. But it's also useful in the context of this video. And we're about to have some fun with it. Let's use the Pigeon Casino for example, which definitely sounds like something I made up, but I didn't. It's an actual grant to Reed College of Portland from the NIH to create a token-based economy where pigeons are taught to gamble with slot machines. So what is the opportunity cost of funding a pigeon casino? Anything else we could have spent the money on? Poverty, homelessness, reducing the $34 trillion we owe for funding shit like pigeon casinos? It just depends on where those fall on our list of national priorities. Moving on, we can also apply the concept of opportunity cost on a micro level. Let's use the PPP loans for this example. The Paycheck Protection Program, where we gave loans to struggling businesses to continue paying their workers. Except by loans, they meant gifts, and instead of struggling businesses, they meant country clubs and billionaires. One of those billionaires was Kanye West, whose shoe company Yeezy got $2.3 million in PPP funds, all of which was forgiven as of August 2023. Kanye is 100% owner of the company, and according to a Forbes estimate in 2019, Yeezy brought in close to $1.3 billion. Kanye himself is reported to be worth $6.6 billion. And while I personally believe this wealth transfer disguised as a loan is an unacceptable use of taxpayer funds, the real tragedy here might be that Yeezy makes these. So what is the opportunity cost of bailing out Yeezy's space crocs? Anything else we could have paid for if we didn't have to send the government a sizable portion of our income. Food, healthcare, shoes that aren't ugly. This is just the tip of the PPP fraud.
Investigators say hundreds of billions have been lost to fraud.
In his role as the head of the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, make sure the $5 trillion in taxpayer dollars.
Wait, how much did he say?
$5 trillion in taxpayer dollars went to the right place.
That's what I thought I heard. Apparently, agency inspectors general are still uncovering the full scope of the fraud, but we do know that at least $1.4 billion went to dead people. This is ridiculous. Where were we?
Opportunity cost is what a person sacrifices when they choose one option over another.
Oh yeah, so when we sacrifice things like food and healthcare and quality of life by choosing to pay our taxes to a government that facilitates the transfer of wealth from its people to billionaires. Let's define it one more time. Maybe we can make it make sense. When a choice needs to be made, so like choosing between groceries or paying our taxes so that Kanye has a pile of money so we can make moon crocs, given limited resources like a fixed income, the value of the best alternative foregone. So here, the opportunity cost of subsidizing Kanye's $100 foam shoes would be whatever value you place on feeding your family. These are real choices that an increasing number of Americans are having to make. People are sacrificing basic needs to line the pockets of billionaires via our own government while our national debt continues to skyrocket. If we're as free as we're told, how is it that we have no agency to stop this? Government-facilitated wealth transfers are not something that free people tolerate. We've barely gotten started, and I can already tell you from a risk perspective that this is not an entity we should feel safe offloading decision-making authority to. When we're the ones making the decisions, we take on full responsibility for the outcome. So we're taking on liability, but we're retaining full agency. In terms of money, if we feel like gifting Kanye $2.3 million is the best use of our funds, we're free to do that. And if we can't pay our bills after that, that's on us. We took that risk. In situations where we are offloading that decision-making authority to something outside of us, like when we give the government a portion of our income and let them decide how to spend it, that risk compounds. We've now handed over agency and given up control. We've shifted the liability to perform onto the external agent, but we haven't shifted accountability. We're still accountable for how that money is spent. It's like being a sales manager where you're not making the sales calls, but you're still accountable for your team hitting its numbers. Except in business, the objective is to make money. The government doesn't make money, they take it. So instead of being accountable for hitting numbers, we're accountable for making sure the government spends the money on its intended use and doesn't blow up the world with it.
Now, we all know about the Americans and their little hobby of getting rid of democratically elected leaders in enemy countries in the third world.
For a leader, you've got to make decisions, and if you do so based upon the Gallup poll, then you're a lousy leader. Agendas don't get set by consensus oftentimes. Sometimes I had information that the American people didn't know and weren't allowed to know. Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere.
I think the Americans knew that he didn't have these weapons. Certainly in the Pentagon, they knew. We were not just misinformed, we were misled by the Pentagon.
Nope, no weapons over there. Maybe under here. Bush doctrine developed right after 9/11. I thought long and hard about it, and I meant it.
As usual, we won the war but lost our freedoms, the real American way.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook.
That was my wheelhouse. I was intelligence. So I knew there were no nuclear weapons in Iraq. It just wasn't there. They had to show us all the intelligence they had. The intelligence did not show that that was the case.
It just kind of was, it evolved. The fact that there wasn't weapons evolved. You know, when we first got in there, started looking around and didn't find anything, you get that kind of sinking feeling that, and then time went on. American people were becoming restless. Members of Congress, said, enough's enough, let's get out. And I was confronted with a choice. Do I accept failure or do we strive for success? But that's just the nature of leadership. Ultimately, a leader leads.
Any other country, I mean, that country would be wiped off the face of the earth by America. Like, any country that had this level of just like insane corruption and just bloodthirstiness.
I found this channel while researching this video, and the info was great, but the delivery was medicine, so I will also link to them below. A minute ago, I said the government doesn't make money. That's actually kind of nuanced, and it's worth breaking down. Technically, it's the Fed, which is not part of the government, and they don't make it in terms of like earning it, more like they make it up. It's called quantitative easing, and it'd be like us adding a zero to our bank account and then buying a bunch of shit to stimulate the economy. Often referred to as QE because it's way easier to say, quantitative easing is when a central bank makes large-scale purchases of financial assets like government and corporate bonds and even stocks, and the amount of money circulating in an economy increases. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's the definition of inflation. But how do they accomplish this? In order to buy assets on the market, the Fed creates new bank reserves, aka they add zeros. This process is commonly referred to as printing money, although it is accomplished digitally. With the newly created funds, the Fed buys securities from major financial institutions, increasing the overall money supply.
That means infusing a bunch more money into the economy. What does that lead to? Inflation. So that devalues your dollar and every single investment that you hold.
That clip was from a video I made a few years ago at the height of my Angry Girl era, and I'm going to be using more of it because it's efficient, so be prepared for this video to get a little spicy at times. So how much money are we talking about here? I came across a fact check of this post while I was researching this. You may have seen it, but the fact checksters were deeming it as false because the Fed wasn't printing paper money, which obviously because they wanted digital currency. Anyway, the post claims that they really printed I guess they should have said infused $8 trillion into the economy. The best way to illustrate this is with the Fed's balance sheet. This is the Fed's balance sheet from January of 2005 to January of this year. The numbers over here on the left are represented in millions, so they're trillions. The blue is Treasury securities, the red is mortgage-backed securities, and the gray is other. The Fed started the QE shenanigans to stimulate the economy after the 07-08 housing crisis, so you can see that uptick right here. You can see that's where they started buying mortgage-backed securities and the gray shit. They weren't purchasing them before this. And this big jump over here is COVID. This is how the Fed makes money, appear out of thin air. We can see several distinct infusions since 08. Now let's see if it amounts to 8 trillion. It'll be a little easier to show this if I slide this over. So prior to the financial crisis, we were at 1 trillion, and then mid-22, we were at 9 trillion. Last time I checked, 9 minus 1 was 8, so that is $8 trillion infused into the economy in the last 15 years. To put that into context, the total amount of cash in circulation right now, the total, is a little over 2 trillion. To be thorough, when the Fed started buying mortgage-backed securities here in the financial crisis, it did drive interest rates down quite a bit, so you may have benefited from a ridiculously low interest rate on your mortgage or anything else you financed during that time, but it was just kicking the inflation can down the road. Before we get to the tea, I'm going to bring back this projected certainty graph to point out that these people here and these people here tend to be more concerned with being right than they are with finding the truth. And the more rigid we are in our beliefs, the easier we are to manipulate. So as you consume this information, I invite you to be aware of your biases. If you find yourself resisting any of the content, it might be a signal of where you're holding rigid beliefs or holding on to false certainty. No shade, we all do it. It's part of building discernment. Perhaps consider it an opportunity to broaden your perspective or cultivate a deeper relationship with uncertainty. This is a quote by Carl Jung that reads, "It is becoming more and more obvious that it is not starvation, it is not microbes, it is not cancer, but man himself who is the greatest danger, because he has no adequate protection against psychic epidemics, which are infinitely more devastating in their effect than the greatest natural catastrophes." This started out as a video, but everything was a rabbit hole. It got really long, so I've broken it up into a series. In the next part, we will investigate our financial risk before diving into our risk of harm. Thank you for bearing with my video making skills, or lack thereof, or bearing with my voice in this intro. I was clearly sick for the second half of it, but I wasn't about to re-record it. And bearing with the sound in general. I'm obviously not a video makist. I am just a girl with something to say I feel is important. It's also a story that is very personal to me. It is closely tied to my journey with long COVID. Without that, I don't think I would have gone down any of these rabbit holes. This journey wouldn't have been a thing, and I probably wouldn't have spent months making this docuseries because I would still have my company. It's not all doom and gloom. There is a hope part at the end. If I didn't believe in humanity, I also wouldn't be making this video. It's also funny at times because some of it's just funny and some of it I make funny to cope. If it gets to be heavy, please take breaks. My intention is not to project or portray any amount of certainty. I think many of us have a feeling that something's really wrong. I actually don't know what the fuck is going on, and that in itself is a problem. It also doesn't appear to be anything good, which is also a big problem. And quite frankly, the things I do know, I don't want to be complicit in. I borrowed a lot of content in this series from a lot of people who are much better at making videos than me, and I also attempt to credit each and every creator below. If I missed anything, please let me know. If I got something wrong, please let me know. I'm happy to correct anything. This is mostly just an invitation for collective inquiry and collective unity. I believe in Team Human, so thank you for being here, genuinely. I am deeply grateful. I hope you enjoy. I love you.
When people say there's nothing I can do about the world situation, it's the same thing. The Krishnamurti quote, that it's not a good measure of mental health to be well adjusted to a profoundly insane society. If my society is causing the extinction of 10 to 30 species every day, if it is increasing the chemical pollution to the point that everybody's becoming infertile and having autoimmune diseases and cancers and neurodegenerative diseases, if it is rapidly building the most horrifying kinds of weapons possible in arms races, is that a sane society? No, it's a fucking batshit crazy society. Do I want to be complicit with it? Am I willing to be complicit with it? Am I willing to have my spot in the history of the world be at the time when human choice mattered more than any other time? Because previously, you could have the fall of a Roman civilization or the fall of the Ottoman or the fall of the Egyptian vast civilizations, but it still wasn't everything. They were still local civilizations. So the precedent is civilization's end. They play their own growth plays a major role in their own end. It doesn't have to go that way. We could go a different way with it. You can imagine that none of the Nazis wanted to defect because if they defected, the idea was they would be killed, right? If they could coordinate and all defect, then there wouldn't have been the genocide in the first place. The ability for people today to realize that the trajectory of the world that we're on is not the trajectory that they want, that they are not willing to be complicit with, that the possibility of changing it is a more potent possibility for meaningful contribution than anyone has ever had in terms of scale. And that that's a more worthy use of their life and attention than whatever is currently engaging it. That, I think, is the only sane assessment.
At the height of the carnage, the Prime Minister of Great Britain had a private chat with the editor of The Guardian. If people really knew the truth, said the Prime Minister, the war would be stopped tomorrow. But of course they don't know and can't know.
La 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 la.